Hi, Misha here, and I have my Finnish Valmet M62S out again, along with the gear, for two reasons. For one, it's my Valmet anniversary. 8 years ago, I started buying these as I found a couple for a good price, and actually had a pretty interesting story. And what I'm going to do there is talk about it, go into more personal anecdotes on my personal channel, which I'll put a link to in the description. So if you're interested in kind of me, myself, and I with Valmets, you can check that out on my personal channel. But with this video, not only will we have the M62 out, I wanted to introduce you to my new Valmet. This is the M78S, and this one's in 308, which is probably the most common for the long, heavy barrel bipod version, which makes sense. If you're going to have the extra length and weight, you might as well make this into a bit of a DMR, since it can't really be a submachine gun. And this is my second one. 8 years ago, again, I picked up my first M78S locally, along with my first M76S, also in 308, and it was a pretty neat buy. But I knew I wouldn't keep them. I used that good fortune to ultimately end up with the Valmet I had always wanted, an M62. Now, we recently talked about this in a $5 Patreon sponsored video, but that was more the design and the military service. In this video, I thought we would talk about civilian imports into the USA. As you know, the M62S is the semi-automatic version of the RK62, which has been Finland's standard issue rifle for over 50 years and is still going strong today. In fact, they now do the RK62M, which is a modernization program. But this is really just a cosmetically updated AK-47 Type 3. Finland would first get those along with the 7.62x39 cartridge in the 1950s, and then Mishaco and Valmet would both make prototypes between 1958 and 1960, and then in 1960 Valmet would be selected with their pre-production model known as the M60. It would be updated and go into service as the RK62. Final tweaking was done by 63, and full production was done by 1965. And over time they would do several things, including update the furniture, add night sights in the late 60s, and as they started to deliver to the Finnish military in the numbers, they had their eyes set on export. They would do semi-autos for civilian markets and select fires for military and law enforcement customers. And this was the very first one. The M62S here is identical to the RK62, right down to the tube stock Michelin Man pistol grip. It's actually a metal grip with the rubber overmold. Cheese grater handguards with exposed gas tube. Even has flip-up irons night sights. It has this unique 3-prong distinctive flash hider with bayonet lug on the bottom for the puka type bayonet, quite famous. It is a slightly longer barrel than in standard AK. I mean just slightly. It's about 16.4 inches. But it is not chrome lined. It has the front sight on the gas block and the rear sight on the top cover. It's on a machined receiver with lightning cuts on both sides, and it feeds from standard AK mags, complete with lanyard loop on the bottom of the mag. It does have an extended mag release and whatnot. This was the first AK of any type to be imported into the US and put on the civilian market. Inner Arms was the early importer. These were approved in 1968, give or take, and started to come in a short time later. And they only brought in around 200 in this military furniture style. And they were only chambered for 7.62 by 39. This meant they were not very successful. For one, military-style semi-autos were not very popular in the late 60s and early 70s in America because, well, frankly, Vietnam War, amongst other things. For another, 7.62 by 39 was a very rare cartridge in America at the time, and when you found ammo, it was exceedingly expensive, and the guns themselves were felt to be exceedingly expensive. And of course, things like AK mags were not standard then either, so they were just not doing well. They were purely a curiosity. The next 800 or so M62S's to come in would be pretty much the same up front, but they would replace the pistol grip with a wood grip and the tube stock with a more traditional sporter looking wood buttstock. And to be fair, they are probably more comfortable from a shooting perspective, but they do lose a lot of cool points. I do have to say that the early M60s sometimes could be seen with wood stocks, but they quickly went to the synthetic style for the FDF. It was just better because the whole idea behind the Valmet was to work well in Arctic climates. But Inner Arms and Valmet knew that if they ever really wanted to get anywhere in the American US market, they'd have to do better. The next, I guess you'd say, generation that Valmet worked on became known as the M71. And actually, this M78 takes a lot from it, but we'll get to that in just a minute. The M71 was much more of a conventional AKM look. Just like here, it has the rear sight and the more traditional AKM position, and the front sight at the end of the barrel still has our 3-prong flash hider, still takes a puka bayonet. It's no longer fully enclosed front sight though. And for the M71, they went to a 16.5 inch light profile barrel, even lighter than this one. They went to a new pattern of synthetic handguards, and originally a new pattern of synthetic buttstock. However, it was not very successful. Whatever polymer they used for the stock was known for cracking, being very shatterable, so oftentimes they would be replaced by wood stocks at some point. They also did an AKS underfolding version, known as the M71 TP. And the M71 would be built on a 1mm stamped receiver, again to save weight, and more of its internals were standard AK-47 AKM as well. They would build them in 7.62 by 39, and, for the first time, 5.56 223 Remington. The 7.62x39 was targeted at the FDF, who would give it a designation of RK71 and would pick up a few hundred, maybe 1,000, for field testing. And it was hoped that maybe they would adopt this because it would be cheaper and faster, but they quickly decided that Finnish conscripts beat the shit out of their equipment, and the M71 was just simply too weak. So it never really went anywhere in Finland. Now in America, a semi-automatic version was built as the M71S, and the only ones we received over here were in 223 5.56. They never did send over a 7.62x39 model. And I don't think they ever sent over an underfolding model, but I could be wrong. But they only built them for a couple of years. It was not a terribly successful design. It seems like primary production was between 71 and 73, and they were brought over and sold throughout the rest of the decade because they weren't selling that great. But they were in 223, which was a much more commonly available cartridge. And because of their stamp construction, they were cheaper. But they just didn't still quite have it. They lost a lot of that refinement that the M62 had. But they were very lightweight. It is worth pointing out that they took proprietary mags that were hard to get then and are impossible to get today. 15 rounders and 30 rounders were the standard. And they would start marking these guns 223, but they would have a 5.56x45 chamber, meaning you can shoot that in them. They marked them 223 for more legal logistics reasons. So, while the M71 was not a success, it would lead to the most successful Valmet series. It's puka time. So, figuring out what did and didn't work about the 62 and the 71, Valmet came back in a big way with the M76, which would be produced in the largest numbers for about a decade. And they would do 7.62x39, 223, and a new caliber, 308 as they were marked, which was actually 7.62x51 NATO, which, like I said, this one's in here. And they would even do 222 Remington for places like France. And they would continue to try to get military and foreign customers as well as civilians. For the FDF, this time they were successful. The new M76 would be very similar to this, but it would have the updated pistol grip, updated handguards that fully enclose the gas tube, still have the same 3-prong flash adder. One thing you don't see mentioned too frequently, they would actually slightly enlarge the protective ears for the rear sight. They would also change the recoil guide rod and spring to make it non-captive. But most importantly, the new, as it became known, RK6276 went to a stamped receiver. But learning lessons from the M71, it was a reinforced stamped receiver. It was thicker steel, and it had more reinforcing ridges, rivets, and welds. The benefit was it saved about a half pound of weight and made the gun more affordable. So what the FDF decided to do, they purchased quite a large number of 62-76s, but still worried that their conscripts would beat them up. They kept these in reserve in case of war, continuing to issue the milled M62 for everyday training and field maneuvers. But the 62-76, along with the KP-44, the 10 Henry, was in storage in case Russia ever got aggressive again. I can't imagine why Finland was worried about that. They would also start experimenting with folding stock models. Most of the ones you see in 7639 would have the fixed tube stock. With the stamped receiver, they would work on a left side folding model. Again, the M76 TP. The FDF would try it out, but didn't think it was durable enough and thought the system was too susceptible to mud. So then they would start working on a right side folding version, which is pretty similar, but a little clunkier than what you find on the Galil. And this would end up appearing on milled receivers, but that's kind of jumping ahead a bit. As for the other markets, they would do quite a few M76s with wood stocks. They would do various folders. And in America, they would send over a token number of 762 by 39s, but the majority were 223s. That was really taking off. And the two most popular 223 styles were the fixed wood stock, often referred to as the M76W, and the left side folding M76F, or M76FS as some people call it. Most of the M76s would be on stamped receivers, but some, like this rifle here, would be on a new pattern of milled receiver that would come into use in probably the 80s. Seems like in the 70s they were still doing the stamped thing. But the milled receiver that started to be used was effectively just as well made, but it lacked the lightning cuts on all three sides, and a few other machining steps were skipped. Also, originally, the fixed stock was permanently attached to the receiver. They would start attaching them using a roll pin, so basically Galil style, which makes a lot of sense. It made production easier, and it made replacing the stock a lot easier. And the new handguards were nice too, and the new pistol grip. You can see the new style they went to that became pretty much a standard for Valmets here. And so the M76 was very popular. The 308s were neat too, but they didn't do as well as the 223s, and only hardcore collectors bought the X39s because you still couldn't get the ammo readily. And like the 223, the 308s took proprietary magazines, which would kind of become a problem. And you would start to see later on not only Interarms as an importer, but also Odin, and as this one is here, Valmet Incorporated of New York. And so with that, let's focus on my new gun here finally, and talk about the final Valmet models of the 1980s. Anyone who knows me a bit knows I really like light machine guns, particularly the RPK. So even though I willingly sold my first M78S and 308 so I could get my M62, no regrets. I've always hoped to have an opportunity to pick up another one in good shape for a respectable price. And finally last week, it happened. Not to give away private details, but a person offered a trade over email, which usually is a bit long and drawn out, but this guy was the easiest guy to ever arrange a trade with ever. I think we settled on it Thursday. I think he first emailed me Wednesday. We settled on it Thursday. He mailed this Friday, and it arrived today, which is a Monday. I'm recording this. And I would actually have his gun out tomorrow, Tuesday, except it happened so quickly, his dealer hasn't had time to email me their license yet. But, yeah. And this is very much identical to my old M78, but in better shape. It has the wood handguard, some have synthetic, and more importantly, it has the milled receiver, not the stamped. Now, the M76 was primarily a return to the M62 pattern, meaning it had the rear sight on the top cover and the front sight on top of the gas block. But with the M78, they again revisited the M71 pattern. Like I said, they put the rear sight. It looks like it's on the front of the receiver or trunnion. It's actually at the very edge of the gas tube. The gas tube comes apart like you would expect on a Galil type. And then again, we have a front sight style here. It's kind of neat. It actually has a flip front sight for using night sights. It still has the 3-prong flash hider. The Finns really love themselves their 3-prong flash hider. Obviously, it had a heavier barrel than the M71, and it's a longer barrel. Overall, including this flash hider, it's just a hair over 24 inches. I think if I were to take it off, this flash hider is quite large. It looks like it'd be probably 22 to 22 and a half inches. So the barrel is actually a little bit shorter, perhaps, than an RPK barrel, which is 23 and a quarter, but it's close. And it has a angled gas block here. Interestingly, the face is flat. Kind of an interesting look, but it has a ported gas tube like the original AK-47. It has the newer style of handguards, although made of wood instead of synthetic, but they encompass the entire gas tube. And it has this carry handle, which in true Finnish fashion is spring-loaded. And any other carry handle you'll find on these types of guns is just free-floating. Nope, not with the Finnish guns. They sprung-load that bad boy. Now the mags are an issue for these, and in more ways than one. You would think, okay, even if they take proprietary mags, all Valmets and 308 will take the same mags. Oh no, no. The M76 and M78 take different magazines. Actually, the M78 can take M76 mags, but they'll fit with a lot of slop. But the M76, as a general rule, cannot take M78 mags because they had additional reinforcements at the top of the M78 mags. Now this is not an original factory mag. This is a 30 rounder from MCP, Maximum or Max Capacity Products. These actually work pretty well. Funnily enough, when they first introduced the 308, Valmet didn't have enough factory mags, so the ones we got over here, especially with the early stamped M76s and M78s, were actually converted Swedish AK-4 mags. That's their licensed copy of the G3, the Heckler & Koch. And that's what this is here too. It's a converted G3 mag. And the converted AK-4 mags will be phosphated, and they will have a crown on them, and they tend to usually be dated something like 1980 or 1981, which tells us about when the 308s were hitting our shores. Later, though, we would see what presumably are factory Valmet 308 mags, and these would have a blued finish, a little bit thinner, and basically have no markings, which is kind of interesting. You'd think they'd have proofs and stuff on them, but they really don't seem to. And while a lot of the 308s have the wood handguard, it seems like not all. Some would have synthetic. They would not just do the M78 in this caliber, they would do 223 and 7.62x39 as well. But 308 seemed to be the most popular chambering for this particular model because people could use it as a target gun thanks to the bipod. So more were sold here. 223s are the next most common, with 7.62x39s the least common. Now with the 308s, you can find both stamped and milled variants. And this is just what I've seen, so take it as an anecdotal thing. The 223 and the 7.62x39 guns I have seen and heard of were on stamped receivers. So what else sets this apart? Well, of course, we have this bipod, which is a pretty unique design. It's held in with a clip here. It's very spring-loaded. It's even pretty easy to remove if you don't want it. No cleaning rod under the barrel. They never put a rod under the barrel with the M71 either. And in the back, we have what most would call an RPK stock, but actually, it's more inspired by the RPD stock. I say that because it has the longer neck here, like the RPD, versus the RPK, which is very short. And also the way it's a very rounded edge. And Finland had a light machine gun, not a great one to be fair, known as the KVK-62. And it used a stock like this. So it seems to have been inspired by the KVK. Now the M78 was Valmet's light machine gun, but actually work on making an RK-62 style light machine gun had started as far back as 1974 in the FDF itself with what we know as the M74. Different project, but similar results to some extent, but the M74 never really got past the testing stage. But of course the M78 did. It doesn't seem like the FDF ever had more than a few of these for testing, and most were sold on the civilian market. But a select fire version, of course, was offered, and as was famously known, select fire M78s were used as RPK, or perhaps RPD in some instances, stand-ins in a lot of Hollywood movies, including Wolverines. Okay, Red Dawn, but yeah, the good one. And several others from that time. Really cool guns. They're honestly not that heavy for what they are. About 11 pounds, maybe 12, fully loaded. Not bad for a 308 at all. Very smooth bolt. The only knock I can give, it continues to use the fragile plastic for the butt plate, which this is one of the nicest condition ones I've seen. Most you see have a crack right in the center. Part of it is how fragile it is. Another part is the buttstock is hollow there to let the screw go through that holds it on the gun. So it's not supported. So if you whack it in the center of your butt plate, it's going to crack. So much though that people have made metal replacement butt plates. The other thing that kind of bugs me, they even use Allen screws on the butt plate. Just kind of weird on a military gun, frankly. Now you might think this looks like an angle cut, but it's not really. On the top and the bottom, if I can show you, The stock actually comes, the receiver, excuse me, actually comes back here behind the pistol grip. And on the top as well, it goes back behind the top cover a bit. So it's actually, the stock is just inlet and goes into grooves in the receiver a bit. No one knows why they did this, but some have speculated just to give the stock additional reinforcement. It kind of reminds me of some of the early the early FAL stocks like used in Israel, the type A, B, and C's, and how they were having trouble with it cracking until they reinforced it. So just kind of a thing to point out, but it has nothing to do with band and stuff because this is all pre-1989 by a long shot. So what about the final days of Valmet? Not just in the USA, but in the firearms business in general. I've often commented that I think what kind of makes light machine guns with bipods neat is how they kind of sit there on their own two legs. But how do you make neat even neater? You stick a knife on the end of it. Yeah, a light machine gun with a knife, because why not? Everything about these is so smooth. There's no grading. Even though this is basically it's just a phosphate finish. It's not a super slick, super fancy finish. It's a very utilitarian, very military finish. But they seem to be very durable, very rust resistant, and the way they polish the metal before phosphating, it still lets things like the bolt move, the safety move very smoothly. The mag catch, the mags insert and come out very smoothly. The bipod does its thing smoothly. It's a very pleasant gun to manipulate. Kind of like the 805 Bren or the Bren 2 and other modern guns that we think of as smooth. Here's our flippy front sight. Flip it up for night, down for not. The fins were a lot more realistic with their sight adjustments too. Depending on the model, typically they go from 100 to either 500 or 100 to 600 meters. And night sights were just a standard feature. Notice this one also has a bit of a brass deflector here, which is kind of a neat touch. These were not revolutionary guns, but like how Finland took the Mosin and just made it subtly better in many ways. That's what they've done with the AK. Here's our MCP mag. It's a neat mag. They actually are pretty reliable too, more than you'd think. So yeah, for the standard rifle, the 223 M76 was the most bestest seller. There we go. But for the bipoded heavy gun, the M78 308 was the best seller. So that's what you mostly find today. They would do a few other versions. For example, as most of you know, there was the M82S bullpup. This was actually developed beginning in 1978 for the Finnish Air Force and for paratroopers. It's a bullpup version of the M76, and while they would trial it, it never was accepted because it's a freaking AK bullpup, and they're very rarely successful. And so they would start exporting them over to us. And again, much like with the M71, we would only get the M82 and 223 5.56 NATO. And most sources claim that Valmet only produced about 2,000 M82s total, select fire and semi-auto. The M78 also got a variant known as the M78-83. It's almost identical to this, except it came with the scope mount and scope, And instead of a clubfoot stock and pistol grip, it came with a SVD Dragunov style black synthetic stock. And some have claimed that these were actually put together by Odin in the USA. Others say that no, it had to have been at least partially done by Valmet in Finland. And it was in the 80s that we really see return to the milled receiver. I think they realized that was just kind of an iconic thing for their brand, much like Arsenal has done in more recent years. And again, they made some simplifications just to make it more cost effective. These were always pretty pricey guns though, even when they were coming in. Just not much you can do about that. Carry handle actually goes all the way over and then springs back. I'm just not letting it slam into my gun. But here's our bipod bracket. So it's not an RPK. I mean, silhouette might be similar, but it is really its own LMG design. Well, getting away from the military look, the final model, at least of note, that Valmet put on offer, was known as the M83 in Europe and as the M88 in North America. Now, you might think they didn't start making those until 1988, but actually, no, they made them at least by 1986 and through 1987. However, towards the end of 1987, or perhaps into 1988, the Valmet Corporation decided to divest itself of its firearms division. And so it was merged with Mishaco. And Valmet had been producing rifles for the Finnish military, true, but really they had focused more on the export market. But their only military customers were Indonesia and Qatar, at least of note. They had a few law enforcement contracts and things like that, but yeah. The 222 version was popular in France for whatever it's worth. But they decided it was time to get out of the firearms game. So Seiko would take over. And actually in the 1990s, for the military, they would come up with a new variant, the RK95TP as it's known. This would basically just update the design with a lot of Galil features, like an upswept charging handle, side-folding stock, ability to take modern optics, the ability to launch rifle grenades, so on and so forth. But they only would build 20,000 or so RK95 TPs between 1995 and 1998. And these are just issued to special forces. The rank and file still carried the good old M62, which is why in the 21st century, really beginning in 2015, they announced the RK62M project. There was a civilian version, usually with a fixed butt stock, but a few with folding stocks, known as the M92S. But unfortunately, these were released after the 1989 Bush ban on imports, so none. Well, actually, I take that back. And I can think of at least one that is here legally in civilian hands. But yeah, they were never officially imported. So truly, Valmet as a firearms company went out of business before even the assault weapons ban, meaning there are no post-ban RK62 derived rifles in America. And when Seiko officially disassembled the RK95 line in 1999-2000, thus ended Finland's long-standing tradition of manufacturing guns for their military. Now, to be fair, with the Mosin they really rebuilt using Russian parts, but with guns like the KP-31 and the RK-62, they built them from the ground up and did a very fine job. Most people call these the Cadillac of guns. I don't know if I'd go that far. They are nice, but I think, and you see this with the Swiss SG-55s as well, when people don't own something and hear how great it is over and over, the echo chamber effect tends to overemphasize how great they are, making them sound cosmic or orgasmic if you prefer. Either way, kind of inflating them to be greater than really what they are. But that's not to say they're bad. They're not. But they weren't perfect. Like I said, they had problems with plastic cracking. Also, the 223 versions had extraction problems sometimes, and they were known to break a firing pin on occasion. And again, above all, you can't ignore the fact that magazines are extremely difficult to find for the 223 and 308 versions, meaning that originals that today go for $300 up. Even converted mags like this one are $100 to $200 depending. And with the 223, some claim you can use Galil mags in them. They will fit, but many others advise not to because of improper feed angles. I'm not getting into that now. Just know it's not clear cut. The good news is with the 308s, you can usually convert 308 Galil mags and HK G3 mags to fit, but with the HKs at least you do need some welding skill, so it's not that easy. So how many semi-auto Valmets are in the USA? Honestly, no one knows. Like I said, 4 companies brought them over. Record keeping wasn't perfect back then. And there's just no numbers. I mean, you'll hear things like, oh, they only brought in 10 M76 folders in 7.62x39. But then the next person says, oh no, they brought in 100. The thing is, when you hear numbers, you have to wonder what's the source. And, I'm guilty of it, of it too, because sometimes when you don't have anything, you just go with whatever. But the fact of the matter is we have no verified documents to that effect, so just something to keep in mind. Valmet estimated that they produced at least 350,000 total, including their military, select fire exports, and semi-auto exports. And serial numbers that we see for semi-autos here seem to start off around 145,000, give or take, and end around 396,000. Very rough estimates, and I'm not saying they ran straight through, obviously they didn't, but that's all we really know are the serial ranges. And that's kind of the history of the semi-auto Valmet, America's first AK. And in fact, it would remain the first AK for over a decade. It wasn't until 1982 that the Egyptian Mahdi, brought in by Steyr, very first appeared. And it actually wasn't until 1984, maybe late 1983, but probably early 1984, that the first Chinese guns came in through companies like Clayco. And really, for the pre-ban era, the only other AKs to come in were the IMI Galil, which is kind of getting almost not even to be an AK anymore, so many changes were made. And of course, the Hungarian SA-85M, affixed in a folder, were imported by Kastner. But that's it. There are no pre-ban Romanians, Polish, Bulgarians, and definitely no Russians. So yeah, if you wanted an AK in 1981, you were getting a Valmet, if you could afford it, and find it. Keep in mind, pre-internet days, It wasn't just as simple as getting up one morning, having coffee, logging onto your computer, and buying it. You had to get a local store to usually order one for you and wait. Some people waited even a year or more to get them in. But these were boutique guns, like I said. That's why when you hear of only like 200 tube stalkers coming in that sound like a tiny number, the fact is that's the market they had. So even though we don't know how many of these came in, it was not a huge number, a few thousand. For example, it's pretty widely agreed that 1,000 M62s came in. We know more M76s came in, so it's going to be more than 1,000. Who knows? Who honestly knows? Even if I gave you a number, it would just be making one up. So I don't want to do you guys that way. I respect you too much. Have a puka of scabbard instead. Reindeer hide. I call it Rudolph. Anyway, I just thought we'd do another Valmet video. I've been doing collection videos lately, but with the rarity and expense of these guns, I've only really been able to afford to have one, at least long term, even though I've owned different ones like M71 in the past. I really would like to find a way to keep this M78. I like my original one. It's neat. It fits my collection well. So, yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But even if I don't get to keep it forever, even just having it for a few months is always fun. Take it to the range, maybe. Enjoy it. And I do have other mags for it, too. The MCP was kind of a cool one to bring out because, hey, it's a LMG. So, 20 rounds is fine. 30 rounds is even cooler, right? Again, if you'd like to hear more personal story time stuff and just musings about guns like these, check out my personal channel. I will put up a video talking about this there. And if you missed our earlier video this year on the military RK62, which was a $5 Patreon supported video, definitely check that out as well. And if you have any information about Valmets, please share it below. And if you have any questions, please ask them below. And let's just have a community dialogue, because these are fun to talk about. As always, we greatly appreciate it if you could like, share, and subscribe. And if you could, check out the link to our Patreon page. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.